Welcome to Belonging Reimagined. I'm your host, Dr. Mona. As a mental health therapist, professor, and researcher, I guide folks in owning their belonging journey and exploring barriers to belonging. In this podcast, I explore real stories with phenomenal guests about how to experience both interconnection and interdependence. And my hope for you is that you learn ways to experience more connection in the world around you and the world within yourself. We don't have to do this life thing alone. You're right where you belong. All right, folks, today we have Dougall Fraser on today's episode. And we are going to be talking about a topic that organically came up when we met a few weeks ago. We were chatting and we were talking about all the things and maybe talking about our experiences in different spaces with different kinds of folks and how our expectations were different than maybe what we had expected. Anyway, wink, wink. What really it came down to that we realized we were talking about was this topic that we're going to delve into in just a moment, which is toxic positivity. But before we do that, I have to talk about how I first met you. We have a mutual friend, Pip Davidson, who had been on the show actually a few months ago to talk about belonging and gender expansiveness. And with Pip, we had been talking about all these wonderful people who might be interested in joining the show. Truly transparent here. And almost immediately, one of the first names that Pip said was Dougall. And I said, oh, tell me about Dougall. I realized that I had your Aura deck and did not realize it was you. I had not put it all together yet in my life because I didn't realize that I knew people who were famous or that I knew people who were famous. So I was like, oh, wait a second. So I went to this event in Phoenix and had already signed up for your event before I had even heard your name from our mutual friend. And I was like, wait a second. This happened with someone else too. I think with Nancy Levin. And I went to your session that you were doing for Hay House, which is a big publisher that's part of now Penguin Random House. And it was on, what was the name of the session?
The Power of Color Energy.
The Power of Color Energy. And I was like, I want to know what color I am. I think you told me I was green. But anyway, the point is that you were so authentic, so real, so moving, so spot on in what you talked about. And one of the things that I appreciated so much about your energy during that session, Dougall, was how whole you show up as, just as a whole person. And that really led to my later on when we met again more recently, one-on-one, to feel like I could be all the things pretty and ugly and in between and all those things. I mean, literally, I showed up with my hair, I think maybe in a top knot or a braid and no makeup and, threw on some big chunky glasses or something, which by the way, I think they were kind of cool. So I take that
They were
part
super
back.
cute. Yeah.
That was the pretty part. The rest maybe wasn't. I was in sweats and you showed up the same way. And it really made me feel like I can be really myself and comfortable with this person. And I don't have to present polished, and I think that really set the stage for what we ended up on in talking about toxic positivity. And in that same kind of light, I didn't feel like I had to be super positive and polished and all the things, even though we met in what would be considered normally, by most people's standards, a very spiritual kind of space when we were at that event in Phoenix. Yeah. And so I want to welcome you to the show. I want to thank you for being here. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
I'm so excited to be here. And I remember that first meeting online too, because I said to my husband, I was like, oh, I have to jump online for like 15 minutes. And I think I came out like an hour and a half later. If not longer. And he was like, I take it that went well. And I was like, I'm obsessed with her. It went really, and I felt the exact same way. There was just a moment where I thought, oh, I can completely be myself. And it was really lovely. So it is my great pleasure and great honor to be here. And thank you for all of the kind things that you said about my talk. That means a lot to me.
So let's go to just basics. And I'm not asking you to define toxic positivity in some academic way. I'm talking about, like, for you personally, what does this term that's really become part of pop culture so much more recently, what does toxic positivity for you mean, Dougall?
Well, for me, it was something I read in the past couple of years that really resonated for me because I have been a seeker in the spiritual community since around the age of like 8 years old.
Hmm.
And I think as a gay person, as someone that saw color and energy around people, I always sort of felt like an outsider. And the New Age community welcomed me with open arms. But even within the New Age community, I started to feel a certain kind of pressure for the way that I was supposed to think, the way that I was supposed to behave, and the way that I was supposed to act. And I went through a period of time thinking that there was something wrong with me because I couldn't maintain this constant high vibration. We hear things like high vibe, positive thinking, manifest, all of these words that sort of project this responsibility of like perfection upon myself. And I just thought I'm never going to get there. I couldn't understand the secret. And then so I saw toxic positivity in sort of the news, maybe a meme or something like that, or an article, and I was like, yes, that is it. It can go so far as this pressure to be perfect, which just is a trigger for me in general in many, many, many ways. So toxic positivity for me is this external pressure that at all times I must maintain a perfect sense of being, of thought, and of consciousness. And that has just never been my experience, and I think can be detrimental to people's growth.
Yes, absolutely. It is detrimental to people's growth. And in what ways do you see that? I'm curious.
The reason, and I can only speak for myself, I should speak for myself. For me, it is a charged topic. And I think the reason that it's a charged topic is that there's this, and you said it, like we were at what is considered to be a spiritual event, and it is a spiritual event, and it's spiritual teaching, and there's movement of energy, but it doesn't mean everybody's holding hands and smiling the entire time. There's still ego, there's still shadow work, there's still complaints, there's still frustration, there's still insecurity. And I'm just talking about my own experience. Yeah. And so toxic positivity for me turned into, I'm not good enough. I'm doing it wrong. Everybody else is getting it faster and differently. And what am I missing? And I just started as a spiritual teacher trying to explain a different process, that even though I meditate, if I get cut off in traffic, I'm irritated. If I get a rejection letter from a publisher, I don't think it's a blessing. I'm annoyed. If I'm trying to manifest something, I still feel like I'm not good enough and can still move energy at the same time. We are allowed to be both things, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that I just brought up Nancy Levin because she was on the show talking about shadow work and how we can't be whole people and truly know ourselves and really self-actualize, if we're going to like more academic terms, but we really can't do those things. In other words, like reach a certain level within ourselves unless we take the whole, what we might see as the good and the bad. It doesn't have to necessarily be bad, right? But what we might initially see it as that way. And I've noticed too that we're stuck in this culture of dualism, right? This very dualistic kind of thinking that it's either this or it's that. Instead of moving towards, I think the call to action is move towards the both and. Yes. You can get a rejection letter from a publisher in your position, right? Dougall as an author, and be both annoyed and also see the blessing in it. Yeah. You can have both of those experiences and many, many other emotions that come with it. We're multifaceted beings. We met recently with Dr. Allison Tompkins, who published actually with Hay House as well. Look at all the Hay House authors who published with Hay House as well and wrote a book, Spirituality is for Every Body, 2 different words, and specifically talking about people with disabilities and seeking spirituality in those spaces. In our disabled bodies, as I have one as well. And it makes me think of I've worked with spiritual coaches and spiritual leaders in the past who see me sometimes in a wheelchair. I might have been when I met you. Most of the time I'm walking with a cane. Today I'm walking without one. So, hey, take that. Um, and almost like pathologize it as if
Mm,
there is something spiritually going on with me
mm,
and that's negative for
yes.
me to be in this body.
As
And
if it's
it's
your fault in some way.
as if
Yeah.
it's my fault in some way. And it's like, actually,
Yeah.
the way that I've created meaning around this, not as a cop out, but as like something that I actually feel and believe, is that I had become almost so spiritually heightened at one point in my life that I was missing the call to action here on this earth. And being in a disabled body now, meaning that I have some mobility limitations, has actually helped tether me to this world so that I can share my spiritual gifts. So it's kind of a fuck you sometimes.
That's a very charged topic, though. I talk about this a lot. There was a period of time where I had tremendous back pain. It's not comparable to what you're talking about, but the kind where like I couldn't walk, radiating down my leg. I went to shamans. Everyone kept saying it was my mother. Everyone kept saying if you could just release your issues with your mother, which there was a kernel of truth to that. I did have issues with my mother, but no one ever told me to go get an MRI. So I kept seeing healers and chiropractors and acupuncturists, and everyone kept blaming me for not clearing the energy. Finally, my husband took me to the ER because it was that bad, like, lifting me into the car. They gave me an MRI and I had a herniated disc. Nobody thought to think maybe there's an injury. Maybe we could look at an MRI. Like everything was just like, well, your third chakra is not clear and it's your fault. Go home and meditate more. And I absorbed that and thought it's my fault. What am I not doing? And this is where things get just a little bit messy because you can't tell me that a 3-year-old with a brain tumor isn't thinking positively enough. That doesn't add up to me. The math doesn't add up in that situation. And so I agree with you that there is this balance of, yes, I believe that our thoughts affect our physical body and our health and our wellness, but traditional medicine is really important as well. And what does it mean for the person going through it? And yeah, it's just a very big, big topic.
Right. And there's an individualism around it too. As we're talking, I'm realizing that we're pathologizing the person that is maybe carrying that certain kind of pain or that certain kind of energy. Maybe that person, if we were looking at it through a spiritual lens, since we're picking on us spiritual folks ourselves, even,
right.
But maybe if we're looking at it through a spiritual lens, that person was sent to you to help you or to invite you to explore certain judgments or perceptions that you might have.
100%. I mean, that's a very Buddhist philosophy, right? That the person that you're triggered by or dealing with is your greatest teacher. It doesn't matter what manifestation that the energy comes in its form. But I think in the world of toxic positivity, I mean, it's hard to talk about for me because I do believe in affirmations, right? And I do believe in manifesting. And I do believe that the way that I think about myself and the words that I use and the adjectives that I use affect my health and my wellness and all of those things. But I just feel like the pendulum has gone too far. And so the question is, how can you find balance for yourself? Like, how can we gain wisdom from teachers who have come before me who were incredible and talking about new thought and new consciousness and all of those things, but it just tends to go a little bit too far. And so I wonder if people are listening can resonate with that because, I struggle with depression, I struggle with anxiety, but I'm always looking at what's the dominant energy of the day. If depression and anxiety are stopping me from living a full existence, then I really want to take a look at that. If I'm managing depression and anxiety, but still being in my power, I'm okay with that.
But you said something I think that was really key. You said that if depression and anxiety are really most prominent part of your day, you want to take a look at that.
Yeah.
See, toxic positivity says don't look at that.
That's exactly right. Don't even think about it. There are spiritual teachers out there who will say that you get like, a minute and 47 seconds to have a negative thought. Well, I can't do that. Sometimes I have half a day where I'm caught up in negativity, but I observe it. And this goes to shadow work too. we were talking about Nancy Levin's work. Even in my deck that you have, we put shadow messages on the deck because I love shadow work. So if someone pulls an inverted card, that's a shadow message. I had no idea, Mona, how triggering that would be for people. We get emails or DMs or people saying, I'm so sad when I pull a shadow message because I must have done something wrong. They see it as a negative. And a shadow message is not a prediction, it's a reflection. A shadow message is, in my opinion, the universe, your higher self, whatever you want to say, saying, let's stop and pause. So I identify as someone who is an anxious person. If my anxiety spikes, I have to stop and pause and think, what's going on with my shadow self right now? What am I worrying about? What are the triggers? It's like the moment to fold the laundry. It's the moment to get organized. And I really love that. It doesn't scare me. I was surprised that it really scares people a little bit.
Because toxic positivity takes away that pause.
That's exactly right.
What happens in that pause that positivity says run?
Most of the readings that I was getting were all positive. The love of your life is right around the corner. The job of your dreams is right around the corner. You're going to do this, you're going to do that. And some of the things really resonated with me, but I wasn't seeing movement in them actually manifesting in my life. When an intuitive sat down with me and said, you have the potential to do ... but your anxiety gets in the way or your self-criticism gets in the way. And let's take a look at how that's playing a role in your life. It really changed my life. I imagine if I did not put shadow messages, this is just my experience. If Radley and I, my co-creator, did not put shadow messages in the deck, we probably would have sold more copies. We probably would have gotten more of a response. It did very well. It's still considered incredibly successful. But I think if it was all sugar, people might have absorbed that a little bit faster. When it comes to nutrients and growth and movement and pushing and really pulling up your sleeves and getting in there, we have a resistance to it. It's not received as easily. And so I think when you just talk about positivity, when you just talk about things being airy-fairy and light and open and movement, it's a little bit easier to digest. It takes a little bit of harder work and courage, in my opinion, to look at the parts of yourself that maybe you don't want to look at.
Are we so scared of what we might see? And or is there also this certain entitlement to being comfortable?
Entitlement to being comfortable is a powerful statement. We live in this era that is constantly encouraging and enforcing us to portray an illuminated version of self. We are not necessarily celebrated in the same way if, I've got overgrown eyebrow hairs and, you can see rings under my eyes and all those things. We're not celebrated in the same way. So I think there's this sort of subconscious programming that is so nuanced and so layered in so many ways that I'm probably not even conscious of, that encourages us not to explore the shadow side. Remember back in the day, would there be like Throwback Thursday and all that stuff?
Yeah.
I used to want there to be like some sort of like Honest Monday, and like Honest Monday would be like, like I haven't taken the trash out. Like, let's all show like real images of what's going on. So that may sound very surface, but I think the root of all of that is that we're not comfortable showing. Even today, I have checked myself twice in my head since we've been speaking. Do you really want to say that? How is that going to be perceived? You're talking about things that are spicy. So I've come to this point where I can divide aspects of my consciousness and still talk to you and have a conversation and still observe my shadow at the same time. I actually have a picture of myself as a kid on my desk. I usually have that there. So in those moments, I can say, I got you. You are not threatened. I'm a sexual abuse survivor. So these conversations will start to trigger my safety issues. Am I safe? Is this okay? How are people going to perceive this? So just the whole idea that I want to show you the rough edges or a different perspective or disagree with someone, and so many different aspects of my aura, of my consciousness, of my being start to move.
Safety, I think, is something that most of us are trying to protect.
Yeah.
And being uncomfortable feels unsafe.
Yeah.
Like you're talking about looking at that little child. And by the way, thank you for sharing that openly with us, because I know that will resonate with so many of us who've experienced all different kinds of trauma. as children. And a lot of times, I mean, to your point, I think we are trying to protect something. But I do believe that the things we're trying to protect are different for each person. And
100%.
people are trying to protect their privileged identities in particular spaces, or even if it's not identities, certain privileges that they might have in certain spaces. Um, and also, this perpetuation of privilege happens with this toxic positivity, I think, oftentimes, in telling people, like, oh, you don't have to be uncomfortable. You aren't the person that has to be uncomfortable. That's for other people. And there's this othering that happens. But who are those other people that deserve discomfort? I'll put it that way. And if that sounds ethereal, let me put it in more direct terms for folks. Well, what comes to mind when I say that?
When you talk about privilege, this is such a part of toxic positivity because, especially in my world, in the world of manifesting, I have brought this up on panels before where we're talking about manifesting and we all go into our steps of manifesting and visualizing it and feeling it, and everyone's got their process. And then I've mentioned before, and where does privilege fit into this conversation? Because I have people that follow my work and students that follow my work, and they want to have a similar trajectory with their career, which is awesome and amazing. But you cannot compare your process to my process because I've had a tremendous amount of privilege in my life. I've been really, really lucky. And so I can't just say I put it up on a vision board, my book deal, and it manifested, or I put it up, my husband and I met because I was clear my energy. Like, there's a certain amount of privilege that helped orchestrate all of those things to come together. And I think it's important to talk about that, where that comes from and what the root is, so that someone born in a different economic background or from a different part of the world doesn't have something on their vision board similar to mine and think, why isn't it manifesting at the same time? That's not fair. We have to understand how the bits and pieces of the puzzle come together in order to help everyone become leaders and everyone move forward and everyone to feel like they belong. So privilege, I think, is a huge, huge part of this conversation. And in the world of positive thinking and new age phenomena, a lot of times it becomes a spicy topic. I have felt people like physically contract. I have been on a panel before where I brought up this topic, and I said afterwards to my friends, like, did you feel everybody like kind of freak out? And then the whole topic was like, no one wanted to even talk about it, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, well, for anybody who's listening who's feeling uncomfortable, I'll straight out tell you, with love, y'all, and I mean it, you aren't entitled to your comfort. And I'll tell you, most people who listen to this podcast really come here for the discomfort because they feel the growth in that. I would say probably the same thing for your card deck that you sold. You were recognizing that possibly it could have sold more if you didn't have the shadow side. But I also wonder how many people bought it because of having that shadow part in it,
And I wouldn't change it, just to be clear. Like, I wouldn't go back and change it. I was just amazed. To me, I love vulnerability. What I always tell people is, if you invite me to a dinner party, chances are I'm going to ask one question that makes half of the table feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I like to think of that as a real charm. It is not always received that way. But
you're going to be my +1 to the next party, because the two of us together will have a big time.
Right. I mean, sometimes my husband kicks me under the table because he's like, what are you doing now?
It's not intentional, though.
No. And I'm genuinely curious. And I really can't think of a single question that someone would ask me that would offend me. It's just my nature. It just doesn't bother me. So I find vulnerability to be a real sweet spot. And for anyone listening, whether you've posted an image of your home or a poem that you've written, or you want to ask your boss for a raise, or you want to do a new project, in my opinion, if you start to feel uncomfortable, I actually think that's the sign you're doing the right thing. If I start to feel too comfortable in life, I'm not exploring enough, something's off. Even when we're talking right now, like, I feel good, I'm excited to be here, but I also feel that sense of vulnerability in my solar plexus in my belly. And I know, okay, I'm moving energy.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I think, in those spaces is where positivity can come in and be really helpful because it can not turn us away from discomfort, but usher us through it.
Correct.
And say, you know what? I'm really uncomfortable about asking my boss for this raise.
Yeah.
Also, you've got this. You can do that. Whatever those affirmations are, whatever that self-talk is that helps usher you through that discomfort rather than turn you away from it. And that might be an example of where positivity can be, I don't know, balanced. Yeah.
Even when I meet someone that's in a new relationship and let's say they've been together for 6 months and they're talking about how great they are and lovey-dovey and they went on vacation and it's showing me pictures and everyone's doing this. One of my favorite questions to ask is, have you argued yet? Which people are always surprised when it kind of takes them back because I'm way more curious about how a couple manages a disagreement and an argument and a challenge than when everything goes really, really well. Because for me, that's the foundation and the core of a relationship. Even with my friendships, people that I collaborate with, it's easy when it's fun. But when we trip over something or when there's a disagreement, that's where things get real. That's where things start to get a little bit juicy. So I love those kinds of questions.
Yep. Well, conflict really can build so much connection for folks, depending on how they do it. To your point about asking new partners about any conflict that they might have faced. Research actually shows that partners who argue within the first 3 months of a relationship and get through it successfully have longer term relationships. Not that that's a marker of a successful relationship, but that in this particular study, they have not only longer relationships, but happier relationships in whatever ways they measured that. And I will say that I have noticed that in relationships that I've had in the past. I used to wear it almost like a badge of honor when I would have a relationship where we hadn't argued. But then when we would argue, the shit would hit the fan because they put me up on some kind of pedestal of really what is toxic positivity, of this person who doesn't argue and who's always helpful and who's always positive and who always offers great insight. And I feel so great about myself. And then it was really pathologizing me when I would be like, hold up a second. I didn't really like the way that went. When really that is a conversation that I'm inviting as a way to bring us closer and to strengthen our understanding of one another, which does create stronger sense of belonging and connection in that relationship. And so toxic positivity can really create more barriers and disconnect in the various places in our lives when we are engaging in it, particularly habitually. Now, sometimes we do it as a way to protect ourselves in a given moment.
Sure.
But when it's a pattern and it's habitual and we start over-identifying with it and then really incorporating it into our sense of self, like, oh, I'm a person who's always positive. First of all, that's a red flag for me.
100%. Yeah, because I've seen many positive people behind stage act not positively at all. So it's 100%. Yeah.
And toxic positivity to me, as I'm thinking through it now, means that someone's not always willing to tell the truth.
Yeah. And they're not being authentic. Yeah. You just brought up an interesting point. I can't remember if I read this or where I heard this, but something about couples feeling insecure about talking about going to therapy, which I thought was really interesting. Because if I take my car to the mechanic or to get the oil change or to get the tires changed, nobody's like, what's wrong with your car? Everybody knows I'm trying to maintain the life of this thing that I love that serves me and I want it to run smoothly. So why is it if a couple goes to therapy and my husband and I go to therapy, we go in the same way that we want the engine to run as smoothly as possible? But if you hear a couple say, oh, we have a couples counselor, everyone at the party goes, oh. What's the scandal? It's so interesting to me that they don't even want to talk about foundation work and maintenance and energy management. It's like we must project. Oh, we don't argue. It's so interesting to me. And again, that is so rooted in our consciousness.
And that's such a great example, Dougall, of a nuanced way that we are being toxically positive without realizing it. So for us who go, oh no, we do tell the truth. We do see the dark side. We do tell it like it is. We're willing to see the whole picture of ourselves and other people and all these things. But do you have an eyebrow raise when you hear things like that? That is
Exactly.
a nuanced way that you've internalized toxic positivity
100%.
without even realizing it.
Yeah.
What kind of messages did you receive about like positive and negative emotions growing up? Because I really wonder if that's at the root of a lot of this for folks of like what it means to have a positive emotion, so-called positive. What does it mean to have what we might call like a negatively charged emotion? What are the
Right.
messages that maybe you received or you've seen other people receive who have maybe internalized them in some way?
I grew up being told that I had a temper when, I think if you're an 8-year-old kid who's being molested and you're acting out, that's not necessarily a temper. You're having feelings that you can't verbalize or express. So for a long time, and then getting into the spiritual community and being told, well, you can't get angry and you can't think that. So for a long time, for me, it was, I'm never allowed to do anger inventory. I'm never allowed to be frustrated. And so I've seen that a lot with clients, right? You have to be a good girl and you have to do, have to be, the peacemaker of the family. I've heard all different versions of this story. And so what I always encourage people to do is to see every single emotion that comes up in your being as a moment of service and exploration to who you are. And
Ooh.
So if I get angry, I really sit and I really observe it. I'm looking for whether it starts to dictate my actions and my behaviors and is like a tsunami effect. I don't want that. But I am allowed to express it. I am allowed, and that doesn't make me a bad boy or a bad person or whatever it is. So all emotions have wisdom. It's the same thing in my world of color energy. This may be sort of a sidebar, but everybody loves to tell me about gold and they love to tell me about blue and they love to tell me about purple. And then people make really strange jokes about earth tones. Oh, I'm having such a bad day. You must see brown in my aura. Oh my God, I'm feeling so negative right now. You must see black in my aura. Or what does that mean? And I think that's so interesting that we've assigned like a positive and negative trait to color and energy and vibration. So just like emotions, all emotions have wisdom. All emotions deserve respect. All emotions deserve honor. It's the same thing with color energy. Every single color in the universe that presents itself to us has wisdom and energy. And I encourage people to play and explore and just observe how it affects you. But we just have these really interesting triggers with colors, emotions. It's interesting.
Isn't it funny how we want to judge things? We don't want to call it judgment because we have to be positive.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah. And I don't think people are doing it consciously. This is like just to show how woven it is to our culture. You'd be amazed how many times people will say, whether it's, you must always be peaceful because you teach meditation. Such a projection. Or this color is good and that color is bad. It's such a projection. Like, it's just interesting to me that we do that inherently.
We want to name things, which I think is so important. But when we put the judgment to it is when it becomes harmful, I think, and detrimental and creates barriers.
And human beings oddly feel safer with barriers in some way, which I think is sort of unique.
There's this containment to it.
Yeah. Even as a gay person, like in the beginning, I speak for myself. You come out and it's like, I want a gay dentist and a gay hairdresser, and I want to go to the gay grocery store and live in the gay area and only go to gay bars and gay restaurants. And, they literally, and it makes sense. I wanted to feel safe. But I think in some regards, I will speak for myself, that the biggest act of coming out of the closet was not just anchoring myself in those spaces, but, just living in a neighborhood where, there's a lesbian couple, but there's a straight couple next door, and there are no barriers. It's open doors for everyone in every way. So I'm guilty of creating my own barriers with this idea that will make me feel safer, where this external environment will make me feel safer. And yet, if we remove barriers and go inside of ourselves to feel as safe as possible, you're invincible because you can live, be, and breathe anywhere.
Yeah, you really can. But I think oftentimes we don't trust ourselves with our own interpretations of what we're going to see outside of those barriers. And so in other words, it's like,
Guilty.
but what if I see something bad?
100%.
I'm so positive. It's like,
Yeah.
and I don't think it's just like you said, I don't think it's intentional
Yeah.
whatsoever, but
Yeah.
it's like, it's so easy. I'll talk about it from a race standpoint. I see people all the time on social media posting pictures of their kids with 11 kids from a birthday party, and they're all white. Okay. And I'm like, that is a container. Your child is now in a container without maybe even realizing it. What's going to happen
Yeah.
if you had a more diverse crowd? Well, there are going to be more different kinds of stories that are going to be told. There might be different kind of food that people are going to be eating in the cafeteria, right? There's
Yes.
going to be different kinds of really lived experiences that your child is now going to be surrounded with. And I know this might be hot for folks that are listening. Love y'all big. Okay. Love y'all big. Also saying we got to start telling the truth. This is part of what toxic positivity is protecting you from, is hearing this more complete story, we'll say. Then it's like, but then I don't know what I'm going to do in that space. Maybe your children actually would, by the way. But
way better than I think adults will.
Way better, way better. But as an adult, right, now you're going to have Black and brown and queer identifying parents.
Right. How do I explain all these things?
Trans parents. You have a wide array of parents coming to these parties.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't know what you're going to do. And I'm not saying it's intentional, and I'm not saying that people would be against it, but it is my possibly bizarre, maybe very poignant example of being in a container, and then all of a sudden what it would be like to be out of that container, and how are you going to use your toxic positivity? Because judgment might come in, and instead of seeing that judgment within yourself, or confusion or curiosity that you're not comfortable with pop up within yourself and judge it, you'd rather keep that away. And so that is an example of how like toxic positivity plays into our lives without us calling it that, but is actually a motivator, I would say, for the kinds of behaviors we have, which again, create smaller, more contained systems that we're in that keep us from expanding and being able to touch this really big, wild, beautiful world that we have out in front of us, you know?
I think what you just stated so beautifully is sort of bringing me down into, I almost want to put this in my own checklist of like energy management, because it's in more subtle ways than I think we're aware of. You know, like it's in the air, it's in your home, it's in your business, it's in your family, it's in your religion. Like it's in ways that we don't know it, not necessarily consciously. And I just feel it sort of in my body, if that makes any sense. I feel very grounded in that. Yeah.
100%. And, you know, earlier I was talking about how one of the motivators for toxic positivity is privilege. But also I think there's kind of the reverse, like flip side of that, talking about kind of being grounded in your body. I was on a trip last week with some family members, and all of us are autistic. So we're all ADHD as well. So ADHD and autistic. And we had been on a plane. There was strong cologne on there. We had been activated. And then we went into a busy airport. They sent us to the wrong gate. We missed a flight. It was a whole situation. And we had to go back on the other side of this large airport, like move around to another terminal and go to customer service. And there was a femme presenting African-American looking woman there. And she was fantastic, like the only kind person in the airport. And I'm in a wheelchair at that time. My family is exhausted, pushing me around, and we're all worn out. And I look at her and I tell her, we're trying to get our seats squared away. And so she gets us squared away. And I have tears welling up in my eyes, not because I'm sad, but because I'm autistic. I'm physically in pain and I'm overwhelmed. So I was having an autistic kind of meltdown in the quietest way that I could. And I was stuttering on my words and having a hard time because my executive functioning started shutting down because of the overwhelm I was experiencing.
Sure.
And all I could say to her as I was trying to get help was, I'm autistic. And she was like, She was so kind. She got the tickets. She's like, "It's all right. It's all right." And so she started getting everything squared away. And she could see then as she gave me the boarding passes, she could see the tears welling up in my eyes. And she said, "You got to hold it together. You got to hold it together." She's like, "You can't do that. Everybody depends on you. They need you." And that felt like toxic positivity for me, even though she was coming from a loving place.
Of course. A
And
place of service. Yeah.
Of course. And
Yeah.
I also felt a certain amount of projection
Of
because
course.
so many Black women feel like they have to stay in that place and that they don't have the privilege
100% to break down and get emotional.
Sitting in that place that's not necessarily discomfort, but truly is not safe.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And yet it's still toxic, mostly to themselves.
Right.
And I've done that as a person of color, where I don't have the privilege of sitting in self-care. I don't have the privilege of sitting in the space. So toxic positivity is in and of itself is also still not a pathology.
Yeah. Yeah.
For some people. For some of us it is, and for some of us not. And for some of us, like myself, sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And it's still harmful nonetheless.
So I'm curious if you saw that in the moment, because that's a very powerful awareness. And then I don't want to project on you, but I'm curious if in that moment, what you wanted was someone to just validate your big feelings. Like you're having, this is a lot right now. This feels intense. But then that awareness that this person can't do that that's very in tune. That's very impressive work.
Well, it's also the work that I do. So, I mean, it's like
I know
if you
a lot
see
of
somebody
teachers out there.
Thank you. No, I did recognize it as she was saying it. And so I was actually trying to be in service to her and say back to her. And it still feels bad. And sometimes we don't feel well. I could barely say the word. So I said some jumbled up version of that. And she just kept pressing on it. And so which I felt then pain for what I assumed was probably her own experience in some way. I could be wrong. That might be an assumption. But I see that and I hear that from my Black femme friends and colleagues and students and supervisees. And I did recognize it in the moment, which was, again, trying to push back.
Not always smiling.
That's exactly, though, what we're talking about. Like, you don't have to go through and say, "Oh, I'm this spiritual leader. I've done all these wonderful, accomplished things in this very spiritual space. And also I can have blank face and not be on 10 when I'm in an airport." Yeah, exactly. That's, I think, like your resistance to the toxic positivity.
Exactly.
Really.
Yeah.
And in that, there's some self-preservation there in many ways.
I like to think so.
Yeah. So, favorite question of the podcast: what does belonging mean to you, Dougall?
Belonging to me means feeling safe. Mm-hmm. And that's a big one for me. That's where my intuition was born from. My intuition was born from trying to decipher whether or not an environment or a person made me feel safe. Mm-hmm. And even just this conversation we're having right now, that moment you had with the woman at the airport and you empathize with her and you realize her position, you're helping that person feel safe. You become feeling more safe. So belonging to me is about safety and feeling like you can be or I can be my most authentic self.
And it's beautiful the way you say that too, because your intuition lies in that safety for you.
100%.
Yeah. And your intuition also then allows you to gauge for safety. So having that safety within yourself, allowing yourself to belong to yourself by seeing, embracing, celebrating yourself, those are the ways in which you are able to access your intuition, which then allows you to gauge for safety in other places to decide if you want to even show yourself in those spaces fully or how much you want to show so that you can decide how much you want to belong there. It gives you agency when you're able to gauge for safety.
And my desire is that if I can find safety within myself, I can hopefully create spaces for other people to feel safe, to be their most authentic self.
Which then gives them a platform for belonging and human connection.
Right.
Thank you. That is beautiful. Thank you for being here, Dougall. I love you so big already. You know, that is like the third time we're meeting. And there's just this deep sense of love. Maybe this time around, this is the third time we're meeting. Who knows how many lifetimes we've had before. But I appreciate you. I appreciate what you do in this world, what you're doing in your communities, what you do in your relationships, just by what you just shared, you know, for your clients. And I appreciate your being here today with us.
Thank you. It's my absolute pleasure. And I'm so excited to get to know you even more and more. It's my absolute pleasure. And thank you.
Oh, you're stuck with me now. You're stuck with me.
I know,
now.
it's done.
All right, folks. Thank you so much, Dougall.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. All of the show notes and links can be found on my website at drmonanour.com. That's drmonanour.com. Throughout most episodes, you'll hear me referring to the belonging model that I developed, which is represented by a belonging life map that helps you explore areas in your life where you feel more connection and areas where you might feel more isolation. And you can get a free copy of your own belonging life map on my website. Again, that's drmonanour.com. If you like the Belonging Reimagined podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review. That can help more folks find us and keep more episodes coming. Until next time, I'm Dr. Mona. You're right where you belong.